They called him Bogey. And even decades after his final bow, the name still carries the kind of weight that stops conversations cold. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just another Hollywood actor. He was the face of the golden age of cinema. Sharp-tongued, cigarette always hanging off his lips, eyes squinting like he'd already seen the worst the world had to offer. Bogart became the blueprint for the American tough guy. But behind the steely glare was a man who commanded the respect of his peers and ran with a crowd that would go on to shape the entertainment industry for generations. Born in New York City in 1899, Bogart didn't grow up dreaming of fame. In fact, he was sent to prep school, expected to become a doctor or lawyer. That didn't stick. He joined the Navy at 18, served in World War I, and came back with a scar and a bad attitude toward authority, both of which would later become trademarks in his film roles. It wasn't long before he found his way to Broadway and then to Hollywood. And once he got there, he didn't just play gangsters. He defined them. Movies like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca didn't just make him a star. They made him a legend. He was the kind of actor who could say more with a single raised eyebrow than most people could with an entire monologue. But it wasn't just his acting chops that made him so magnetic. It was his no-nonsense personality. He didn't play the Hollywood game. He was blunt, brutally honest, and had zero tolerance for phonies. And people loved him for it. But here's where things get interesting. Bogart wasn't just an actor. He was the original leader of what we now call the Rat Pack. That's right, before Frank Sinatra ever took the reins. It was Bogart who gathered a circle of hard-drinking, sharp-witted entertainers who met regularly at his Holmby Hills home. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was just a group of friends, actors, comedians, musicians, blowing off steam, playing cards, and throwing elaborate parties that became the stuff of legend. And Frank Sinatra? He wasn't just a guest. He was a protege of sorts. Bogart and Sinatra had a bond built on mutual respect. Bogey admired Sinatra's raw talent and guts. Sinatra, on the other hand, idolized Bogart. They were two sides of the same coin, both rebels in their own ways, both allergic to Hollywood phoniness, and both fiercely loyal to their inner circle. So when Bogart passed away in January 1957 after a battle with esophageal cancer, it hit Sinatra hard. He was one of the pallbearers. That's how deep the respect ran. Which brings us to the mystery. If the two were that close, why does the internet claim that Bogart snubbed Sinatra's funeral decades later? How can someone pay their respects in death, but then supposedly reject the same man 40 years after their own passing? Something doesn't add up, and that's exactly where this story takes a turn. But that wasn't the whole story. The rumor that Bogart snubbed Sinatra's funeral has a darker, stranger twist. And it all starts with one outrageous headline. Rumors have a funny way of outliving the truth. Somewhere along the winding corridors of Hollywood gossip, a bizarre claim began surfacing that Humphrey Bogart, the man who helped usher Frank Sinatra into the Rat Pack, had refused to attend Sinatra's funeral. At first glance, it reads like a bombshell revelation, a betrayal from beyond the grave. The headline alone is enough to make anyone click. But the more you look at it, the stranger becomes. Because here's the catch. Bogart died in 1957, and Sinatra's funeral didn't take place until 1998. For decades stood between the two events. So how did this impossible story gain traction? The answer lies in the slippery nature of celebrity mythology. Bogart's reputation was larger than life, and Sinatra's was just as towering. When you combine two names that are iconic, people almost want there to be some secret feud, some hidden animosity. The internet, tabloids, and even casual retellings thrive on drama. And what better drama than a supposed snub at a funeral? It's the perfect recipe for whispers and clicks, no matter how impossible the timeline. But the myth didn't come out of nowhere. During the 1990s and early 2000s, just as the internet was beginning to democratize rumors, old Hollywood legends were being recycled and repackaged for a new generation. Stories about the Rat Pack, their hard partying, their rumored rivalries, and their wild nights circulated endlessly. Somewhere along the way, Bogart's name got tangled in a web of half-truths and misremembered stories. Some fans speculated that maybe Bogart's widow, Lauren Bacall, had distanced herself from Sinatra at some point, and the story mutated into Bogart himself refused. Others suggest that because certain Rat Pack members, like Dean Martin, skipped Sinatra's funeral, the blame somehow shifted retroactively onto Bogart, who by then had been dead for decades. It also doesn't help that Bogart and Sinatra, while close friends, had very different public personas. Bogart was a grizzled, no-nonsense tough guy. Sinatra was a smooth, sometimes volatile crooner. Both men were fiercely independent. Both had reputations for not taking SHD from anyone, and both occasionally clashed with the Hollywood machine. So when modern audiences hear about a supposed rift, it feels believable even if the details don't match up. And that's exactly why this rumor spread like wildfire. It felt true, even though it couldn't possibly be. The myth gained even more momentum in the age of clickbait headlines. A shocking claim like Bogart snubbed Sinatra's funeral in fury is irresistible, especially for fans of old Hollywood. It suggests a secret feud, a buried grudge, a story the public was never supposed to know. And let's face it, people would rather share a juicy rumor than a boring fact. The fact that Bogart had passed away long before Sinatra is simple and unexciting. But the rumor makes you lean forward, wondering what scandalous detail is hiding just out of reach. And so the myth lived on. Even now, it resurfaces in social media posts, articles, and YouTube videos. But behind every headline is the same nagging question. If Bogart wasn't even alive in 1998, then why does this rumor refuse die? The answer lies not in the funeral itself, but in the tangled history between Bogart, Sinatra, and the Rat Pack. And what happened next would blur the line between myth and reality even further. Here's where the whole story starts to unravel. To really understand how strange this rumor is, we have to look at the actual timeline. Humphrey Bogart passed away on January 14, 1957, after a grueling battle with esophageal cancer. He was just 57 years old. The funeral, held in Los Angeles, was one of the most emotional send-offs Hollywood had ever seen. The guest list read like a who's who of the golden age: Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, and yes, Frank Sinatra. In fact, Sinatra wasn't just in attendance. He was one of the pallbearers. He carried Bogart's coffin with his own hands, a final act of loyalty to the man who had once welcomed him into the Rat Pack. That single fact alone destroys the idea that Bogart and Sinatra were estranged at the time of Bogart's death. Now fast forward 4 decades. Sinatra's own life came to a close on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82. His funeral was a massive event, with celebrities, politicians, and old friends gathering to pay respects to O.L. Blue Eyes. But Humphrey Bogart wasn't there. How could he be? He had been gone for 41 years. Yet somehow, in the blur of stories that followed Sinatra's passing, whispers emerged that Bogart had snubbed the service in some act of fury. The problem is, the numbers don't lie. Bogart wasn't just absent. He was long gone. So why does this matter? Because it shows how easily the human brain can twist timelines when emotions and legends are involved. When two icons are so closely linked in the public's imagination, their stories can bleed into one another. People remember Bogart as the Rat Pack's original ringleader. They remember Sinatra taking over after Bogart's death. And when Sinatra died decades later, some storytellers couldn't resist pulling Bogart's name back into the spotlight, even though he had no part to play in that chapter of history. The rumor becomes even stranger when you consider the very opposite is true. Bogart honored Sinatra in life. Sinatra honored Bogart in death. The bond between them was publicly acknowledged. So why does this warped narrative of a funeral snub still hold weight? Because a feud is more dramatic than friendship. A betrayal makes headlines. A loyal bond doesn't. And the internet, with its hunger for shock value, always chooses a story that makes people click. If we stick to the facts, the case is closed. Humphrey Bogart did not and could not have snubbed Frank Sinatra's funeral. But facts rarely end stories. Instead, they spark more questions. If Bogart couldn't have been the one, then who was? Could another Rat Pack member have skipped Sinatra's service, and the story just got twisted over time? Or was this entire rumor the product of clickbait writers desperate to stir up a scandal where none existed? The trail doesn't stop here. Because when you dig into the relationship between Bogart, Sinatra, and the Rat Pack, you find layers of intrigue that make the myth almost believable. And what comes next reveals why people keep resurrecting this strange rumor decade after decade. Long before Frank Sinatra became the face of the Rat Pack, there was Humphrey Bogart. It's easy to forget now, but the group that would later define an entire era of Vegas nightlife didn't start with tuxedos and stage lights. It started in Bogart's own living room. In the early 1950s, Bogey and his wife, Lauren Bacall, would host small gatherings of actors, singers, and comedians at their Holmby Hills home. It wasn't supposed to be a brand, and it definitely wasn't meant to be a franchise. It was just a circle of friends who drank, smoked, played cards, and told stories until the sun came up. They jokingly called themselves the Holmby Hills Rat Pack, and Bogart was a natural leader. Sinatra was a regular fixture at these gatherings. By this time, he was in a career slump. His voice was under strain, his movie roles had dried up, and his reputation had taken hits. But in Bogart's circle, he found something more valuable than fame: acceptance. Bogey liked Sinatra because he was real. No Hollywood fakery, no pretense. Sinatra, in turn, idolized Bogart. Here was a man who had built a legendary career by refusing to play by the rules. For Sinatra, who was constantly at war with critics and executives, Bogart's defiance was something to look up to. That bond extended beyond late-night parties. When Bogart fell ill with cancer in the mid-1950s, Sinatra stayed close. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was family. Sinatra's loyalty showed in 1957, when Bogart's funeral came around. As one of the pallbearers, he didn't just attend. He literally shouldered the weight of Bogey's coffin, a symbolic gesture of the deep respect he had for his friend. That image alone tells you more about their connection than any rumor ever could. But relationships are never perfect, especially in Hollywood. Sinatra had a reputation for being temperamental, prone to grudges, and quick to explode when slighted. Bogart, on the other hand, had a sharp tongue and no patience for nonsense. It's not hard to imagine moments where sparks flew between them. After all, when two strong personalities collide, friction is inevitable. But those clashes never broke the bond. If anything, they cemented it. Bogart's inner circle was built on honesty, and Sinatra knew where he stood. After Bogart's death, Sinatra didn't just step into the spotlight of the Rat Pack. He expanded it. What began as casual gatherings at Bogart's house became a global phenomenon, with Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and others taking the stage in Vegas, redefining entertainment. Sinatra may have worn a crown, but it was Bogart who first forged a kingdom. This is why the funeral snub story makes so little sense. The real story is richer, deeper, and far more compelling. These two men weren't enemies hiding secret grudges. They were kindred spirits navigating the highs and lows of fame, bonded by mutual respect. Which leads to a bigger question. If their connection was this strong, how did the myth of betrayal take root in the first place? And that's where things get complicated. Because while Bogart couldn't have been the one, others in the Rat Pack made choices at Sinatra's funeral that fueled speculation. So if Humphrey Bogart couldn't possibly have skipped Sinatra's funeral, who did? This is where the rumor takes on a life of its own. When Frank Sinatra passed away in 1998, the funeral was one of the biggest celebrity events of the decade. Politicians, movie stars, musicians, and close friends all showed up to pay their respects. But just as important as who was there was who wasn't. One of the most glaring absences was Dean Martin. Martin had once been Sinatra's closest stage partner, his right-hand man, in the golden years of the Rat Pack's Vegas reign. Fans expected him to be front and center, sending off OL Blue Eyes with the same swagger they once shared on stage. But Martin didn't appear. In fact, he had largely withdrawn from the public eye in his final years, plagued by poor health and personal struggles. To outsiders, his absence looked suspicious, maybe even cold. Whispers started, did Martin snub Sinatra? Was there a falling out? And like all good gossip, the story snowballed. It wasn't just Martin. Other notable names tied to Sinatra were also missing. Some had their reasons. Some were battling health issues, and some simply preferred to grieve in private. But in the world of tabloids, explanations didn't matter. A missing face was enough to spark speculation of a feud. And when writers went digging for juicy copy, Humphrey Bogart's name, already tied forever to Sinatra as the Rat Pack's original leader, got dragged into the mix. Never mind that Bogart had been dead for decades. To the casual reader, the headline Bogart Snubbed Sinatra's Funeral looked just scandalous enough to share. There's also another layer, Bogart's widow, Lauren Bacall, who had her own complicated history with Sinatra. After Bogart's death, Bacall and Sinatra briefly dated, but the relationship ended abruptly. So abruptly that Bacall once described Sinatra as a man who disappeared without a word. That tension lingered for years, and when Sinatra's funeral came around, Bacall did not attend. This fueled speculation of bad blood, which some storytellers later twisted into a narrative involving Bogart himself, even though he was no longer alive to play any role. Add all of this together, Dean Martin's absence, Bacall's history with Sinatra, and the endless appetite for Rat Pack drama, and you got the perfect storm for misinformation. A story that started with a grain of truth, that not everyone close to Sinatra showed up, morphed into a legend that even Bogart had refused to honor his old friend. But what's most fascinating is not how the rumor started, but why it refuses to die. In an era where facts are easy to check, the story still pops up again and again. Why? Because it feeds into a bigger narrative about Hollywood icons. That behind the glamour, the friendships are fragile, the loyalties are shaky, and even the strongest bonds can break in moments of pride or anger. It's not true in Bogart's case, but the myth feels so perfectly dramatic that people keep retelling it anyway. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Because if myths like this can twist something as straightforward as a funeral, what does it say about the way we remember Hollywood legends at all? The strange thing about myths is that they don't need to be true to survive. In fact, sometimes the less believable they are, the more they spread. The story of Humphrey Bogart snubbing Frank Sinatra's funeral is a perfect example. The timeline is laughably wrong. Bogart had been gone for over 40 years when Sinatra passed, but the rumor still circulates online, passed along as if it's a dark Hollywood secret. So the real question is, why do people want to believe it? Part of the answer lies in the way we view celebrities. Stars like Bogart and Sinatra weren't just entertainers. They were larger-than-life figures who symbolized entire eras. Bogart represented grit, defiance, and no-nonsense toughness. Sinatra embodied charm, rebellion, and a certain dangerous charisma. Put the two together, and you get a pair of titans whose friendship feels almost mythical. And with myths come the inevitable whispers of betrayal. People crave stories where legends clash, because those stories feel more dramatic than simple loyalty. Another reason the rumor sticks is because it plays into the cultural obsession with feuds. Audiences love rivalries, whether it's boxers in a ring, musicians trading diss tracks, or movie stars rumored to hate each other behind the scenes. Conflict sells. A story that Bogart supported Sinatra as a friend, carried his coffin, and respected him deeply? That's touching, but it doesn't generate headlines. A story that Bogart snubbed Sinatra's funeral in fury? That's a hook. Even if it's impossible, it feels juicy enough to share. The media has always fed that hunger. In the early days, it was gossip columns that thrived on half-truths and blind items. By the late 1990s, tabloids were still running wild with rumors about who showed up to which funeral, who wasn't invited, and who might secretly have hated whom. Fast forward to the age of the internet, and those rumors found new life. Online, misinformation spreads faster than correction. A flashy headline can race around the globe before anyone has time to point out the timeline error. By the time fact-checkers weigh in, the story has already sunk its claws into the public imagination. And then there's nostalgia. The Rat Pack represents a time in Hollywood that feels glamorous, dangerous, and untouchable. Fans long for stories about that world, and the darker, the better. Tales of loyalty are heartwarming, but tales of betrayal are irresistible. So even when the truth is clear, that Bogart never had the chance to attend Sinatra's funeral, the myth feels like it belongs to the larger narrative of Hollywood drama. People cling to it because it fits the story they expect to hear, not the one that actually happened. This is why, decades later, the rumor hasn't faded. It's not really about Bogart or Sinatra anymore. It's about the way we, as fans, consume legends. We prefer the version that shocks us, even if it makes no sense. And in that way, the myth says more about us than it does about them. But if myths can so easily overshadow facts, what does that mean for the real history of Bogart and Sinatra? The truth is far more compelling than the lie, and it tells us something about Hollywood that most people never stop to think about. When you strip the rumor down to its bones, the truth is surprisingly simple. Humphrey Bogart couldn't have snubbed Frank Sinatra's funeral because he'd been gone for decades by the time it happened. The cold, clear timeline leaves no room for debate. Yet the persistence of this story says a lot about the way we remember legends. It's not the facts people cling to, it's the drama. Bogart and Sinatra weren't enemies. They weren't feuding stars throwing shade across decades. In reality, their connection was one of respect, loyalty, and even admiration. Bogart welcomed Sinatra into his inner circle at a time when Sinatra needed friends the most. Sinatra returned that loyalty by carrying Bogart's coffin, paying his respects in one of the most personal ways a man can. That single moment outweighs any rumor of betrayal, but it doesn't make for a scandalous headline. So, why does the myth linger? Because it fits into the narrative people expect of Hollywood. The idea that behind the glamour, there are grudges, bitterness, and secrets hidden from the public eye. We like to imagine our icons not as flawless heroes, but as messy, complicated people who clash in dramatic ways. In that sense, the story of Bogart snubbing Sinatra's funeral lives on not because it's true, but because it feels like it should be true in a world fueled by rivalry and betrayal. But here's the irony. The truth is actually more powerful. Bogart didn't turn his back on Sinatra. He couldn't have. He wasn't there. Instead, Sinatra was the one who stood by Bogart when it mattered most, carrying him to his final resting place. Their friendship wasn't defined by feuds or betrayals, but by mutual respect in life and in death. That a far more compelling legacy than any rumor could ever create. And yet, the myth refuses to die, circulating endlessly in articles, YouTube videos, and whispered conversations about what really happened. It's a reminder that in Hollywood, perception often overshadows reality. Legends aren't built on fact alone. They're built on the stories people choose to believe. Whether true or not, these stories stick because they satisfy our craving for drama, even at the expense of truth. So maybe the real lesson here isn't about Bogart or Sinatra at all. Maybe it's about us. About how quick we are to believe the dramatic version, and how slow we are to look at the facts. Maybe it's about how myths survive not because they're accurate, but because they're irresistible. In the end, the story of Humphrey Bogart and Frank Sinatra isn't one of fury or betrayal. It's one of loyalty, legacy, and the strange way myths can twist even the simplest truths. And that leaves us with one haunting question. If a story this easy to disprove can live on for decades, how many other truths about Hollywood are nothing more than myths waiting to be untangled? If you found this story eye-opening, there's plenty more where it came from. Hollywood's past is full of rumors, myths, and half-truths just waiting to be uncovered. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more untold stories, and tap the bell so you never miss what's coming next.